Yeah, so thanks again, Mr. Chris, for being present to give us this lecture. And yeah, you have now the room. Please share your screen and yeah, let's learn from you. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Jude, for this very nice introduction, and thanks for having me. I will try to share my screen if that works.
Yeah, it should work.
Yeah, looks like it might work. Okay. Okay, I will try to. I hope this works. Just tell me if it doesn't work, because I might have to share my whole screen here. So now, do you see my presentation?
Yes, I see your presentation now.
You can see it, and you can also see it when I change slides.
Yes, we can see when you change slides also. So I don't know if you want this view or you want it in the presentation mode. Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. So if you can see everything, then I'm happy. So,
but it's not in the presentation mode. Do you want it?
It's not in.
Like just both screens are showing, so we see the presentation and then we see also when you change slides. So that's fine by you. We see both screens.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see. Well, how do I? Can I change that? But I mean, if it's okay for you,
yeah,
then,
it's okay.
Okay,
yeah,
because
it's okay. We can use it like this. It's also fine. Yeah.
It's weird because I'm using an external monitor, and that one's not showing the presentation mode. But anyway, I'll just try to keep track of time a little bit. So, hello and thanks from my side. You have already introduced me, so yeah. Well, I'm happy to be here today, and this is the theory session. So. Here's a short outline of what I have planned. So maybe I'll skip through the introduction a little bit and then go right into the role of theory in social epidemiology. And then, of course, I thought like the most important part would obviously be the key theoretical perspectives. So that's where I have planned to take most of the time. And then I would like to close the webinar with some thoughts on applying these theories to actual research design. And hopefully I will, as I've said, I'll keep track of time, so I might skip something if it's going to be too long, because I think we should also have some time for discussion afterwards. So. Yeah, short introduction. You've already said it. I'm a PhD student at University of Salzburg. My name is Chris Etter. I'm working on my dissertation on the psychosocial determinants of subjective well-being in times of crisis. And I'm coming from the whole medical sociology kind of branch within sociology, but I'm also very interested in health sciences in general and also public health. Here in Salzburg, we're also doing a lot of research on well-being, quality of life, and I'm actually here employed in the whole survey research section. So survey research is also one of my research interests. And here in Salzburg, I'm teaching medical sociology at my university, but also at the Paracelsus Medical University. So I already have some teaching experience when it comes to all these theories, although I have to say usually I take a little bit more time for these whole theory sessions because it's a lot, but I will try to do my best in this session to provide an adequate overview of the most interesting parts. So just very shortly, because I'm not an epidemiologist or a public health scientist, I'm a sociologist, or maybe even like a medical sociologist, because I've been dealing with this topic since my bachelor's thesis. And basically in sociology, what we are doing is we are researching individuals within societies, like are they influenced by social norms or social structures, stuff like that. And now medical sociology is the branch of sociology that actually applies these sociology related theories and methods to the study of health and medicine. And as you can see here in this quote by Jermoth, like the difference between our disciplines is rather small. We are also dealing a lot with the social origins of health problems. We're also using quantitative and qualitative methods. And I think that's the most important part. We have in medical sociology, we have three main areas of research. We are dealing on the one hand with the social construction of health and illness, the social production of health and illness, and then the social organization of healthcare and medicine. And I would say I come from this kind of area, from the production paradigm within medical sociology. And I think that's kind of very close to social epidemiology. Actually, in some textbooks, you even, this is like AKA'd with even with social epidemiology. So that's where our disciplines meet, just to clarify where I come from. And as you might guess, because I'm not a theory researcher, so I don't do actual research on theory like the paradigms or the history of certain theories, but because I'm a survey researcher, I'm dealing a lot with constructing surveys. I'm also part of the team that does the Austrian social survey. So when we are designing these surveys, we always have some theories in mind that that guide our survey design and our research. So I think that's why it's really important to engage with the role of theory also in social epidemiology. And now I would get right into it, because, well, first, why is this even important? I've already said it, because when we are looking at theory is something that that tells us something about the mechanisms that are at play. And for example, when we're dealing with the social determinants of health, that might be very interesting, but just like looking at them descriptively might not tell us something about the actual mechanisms that are at play. So we need some kind of causal models and kind of a story behind it, and that's where theory comes into play, because it also guides our formulation of hypotheses. So we are scientists, so all of this must be testable, and that's where theory comes in. Now, I want to deal also quickly with some of the critique on epidemiology, like not from a sociological perspective, but from perspectives actually within epidemiology, because, for example, Krieger criticizes that epidemiology often just focuses on the biomedical approaches, like risk factors and their distributions, lifestyle, and biomedical factors. And so when it comes to these broader social perspectives, often there is kind of this lack of theory that is perceived. So really often the most dominant approach is this combination of medical and social science concepts with like a focus on the individual level. And so contextual health risks are often neglected. So, but if we want to deal with these determinants, with these social determinants, we actually have to know what are the mechanisms, and that's why today we will talk about theory. This is basically the same, what I've already said. It's a quote from Nancy Krieger, and she also says that we need theory because it helps us to structure our ideas so as to explain causal connections between some specified phenomena. So that's the basic takeaway of this introduction, I guess. And here I hope everyone can see it. I think it's a little bit low resolution, but this is one example. Like, this is a conceptual model of the links between social inequality and health inequality. And we can already see how it's like it guides us by giving us some mechanisms, like how does social inequality produce health inequality? By creating disparities in health liabilities and resources, by creating disparities in health care supply, but also through creating disparities in health behaviors. So that might be one first step when we're, for example, researching health inequalities. However, there's still not much going on here. So I will address some of these issues by introducing some special theories. And before I will go right into the theories, I would like to clarify some, I think, very basic perspectives that we need if we are dealing with the effects of societal factors. Doesn't matter in which discipline, but also, of course, in health. Because when we're dealing with societal factors and with their role, we are usually confronted with the so-called structure agency debate. So what does that mean? That just means that we have to ask ourselves, to what extent are humans actually shaped by their surroundings, by social structures? And there's like two ideal type ideas about that. There's the structure perspective, the top-down perspective, where we say that structures impact individuals, like through norms or health systems, which can determine who has access to care or who doesn't have access to care. And then there's also the so-called agency perspective. That's more like the bottom-up logic, where we focus on individual or collective action that creates structures. So, for example, activism. So activists fighting for a more just healthcare system and then manage to change structures, for example. Although that's very, I know that's a very, that's not how it works, unfortunately, in the real world. A bit harder than that, but that's the whole thought about the agency perspective. So, but of course, that is something that we have to criticize, because when we're dealing with health, we have to say, of course, individuals are never like 100% autonomous, but they're also never 100% determined by structures, by external factors. So we kind of need a combination of both perspectives to explain these interactions between social factors and health. And what I also really like is this visualization, because it already implies something about differences between social groups. As you can see here, this visualization implies that top-down influences are more prevalent among individuals with lower socioeconomic status, while the bottom-up influences are stronger for the higher SES individuals. And that makes a lot of sense, I think, because if you have a higher socioeconomic status, then obviously that goes hand in hand with more resources, so you can influence your surroundings more than somebody with less resources. And of course, what's also important, I think, is that we have to beware of deterministic thinking, because as Krieger already points out, structures do not determine us, but they do influence the probability of actions or attitudes. For example, just because somebody's poor doesn't mean that this person must develop some kind of health problem, but it's more likely than if that person wasn't poor, for example. That's what Krieger means by this. So And then there's some basic mechanisms also that explain the link between social factors and health. And they're usually called like the social causation hypothesis. So that's when social factors, when we are implying that social factors affect health, like poverty leads to depression. But obviously that also goes the other way around, and that's what we call social selection. For example, some health-related factors like depression, they lead to poverty, like they impair my chances in life or prevent upward social mobility. Now, what's important is, of course, these processes, they can also overlap. So poor living conditions, they might lead to the depression, but then depression leads to further deterioration of living conditions due to poverty, for example. And there's even empirical evidence to that, like that's kind of the downward spiral logic to that. And what's important is these mechanisms, they are also kind of dependent on which type of illness we're actually examining. For example, if a disease or an illness has like a very strong genetic or biological underpinning, then very often this social selection and drift hypothesis is the one to go with. But if the role of external stressors, for example, is more important, then we might, for example, be better off with the social causation hypothesis. So just so that everyone has heard of these, I think that's really important, because today we are dealing with mostly the causation theories, and this is how Krieger basically conceptualizes those causation hypotheses. She says basically there's like the mainstream epidemiology, that's basically biomedical plus lifestyle theories. And then there's the social epidemiology alternatives, which cover the socio-political dimension, but also the psychosocial dimension, which is basically stress. And then she constructs her theory, which is the eco-social theory. We will talk about that at the end a little bit, which is kind of a synthesis of all these theoretical approaches. But even though Krieger like typologizes these theories that way, I will start with actually lifestyle theories, because I think it's important to not disregard these theories as individualistic, as long as we contextualize them in a sociological way. And I will show you how that is done by introducing the health lifestyle theory, which is a theory that it was coined by William C. Cockerham, who's a sociologist. And he now has a different understanding of lifestyle, actually, than most mainstream epidemiology. He sees lifestyles or health lifestyles as a collective pattern of health behavior. So this is actually something that belongs more to a group and not only to an individual. So he says that these health lifestyles emerge as an interaction between individual life choices, like preferences that we have, but also some structural constraints, which he calls the life chances. So they are therefore also manifestations of social inequalities and not just individual choices. That's very important when we're talking about lifestyles from a sociological perspective. And this is how the model actually looks like. It's a very big model, and it has different steps. They're numbered. And it goes all the way from like class circumstances to the actual health lifestyles. And because this is such a big model, I will discuss it in two parts. Like the first part here basically describes how social circumstances and inequalities influence our choices and opportunities. Like here you can see that our preferences, our life choices are basically shaped by socialization experiences, class-specific socialization experiences. For example, which families we are born in, which religious communities we are in, etc. But they also determine the opportunities that we have in life, like how much money we have, are we born into a wealthy family, etc. So, and what's important is that there's like this interplay between the life choices and life chances, and individuals also always evaluate their preferences, but they make decisions by also looking at their opportunities. Like, so there's always stuff that people can't do because of diverse structural constraints, for example. Income being the most obvious one. And now we've seen that these choices and chances, they interact and they lead to this like milieu-specific behavioral dispositions. So in sociology, we call this the habitus. This is a term coined by the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And the habitus basically means that we get a specific view of the world, like, and specific dispositions to act that we get from our socialization, but also from the constraints that we are confronted with. And as you can see here, this habitus, these dispositions towards action, they result in specific health-related behaviors, for example, smoking or exercise, checkups, etc. And they then combine to form a health-related lifestyle. Like the sum of this, these practices and through reproduction of these practices, a health-related lifestyle emerges. And what's important is we have discussed like the top-down perspective, but Cockerham also stresses that there is, of course, also this kind of bottom-up perspective. So, so this doesn't mean that we are determined by our socialization. There are still, the habitus is still open to experience and also creativity. So there are chances, for example, by educating people. So dispositions can, of course, be adapted, but it might be a little bit harder than because we might have to think why people are developing certain health lifestyles. And it's not just, as we can see, these individualist factors like personality, etc. It's also social surroundings. And this is also, also leads us to like, for example, when we're looking at health lifestyles, we can always see that there's like this social gradient. For example, that in upper social classes, their lifestyles are usually healthier because here we have better opportunities for relaxation, exercise, also nutrition, and generally better living conditions. So what we see here is that actually opposed to like the mainstream understanding of lifestyle, we see that health-related lifestyles are actually one of the mechanisms that cause health inequalities, but they are also determined, at least partly, to some degree by social inequality or social background. So they are kind of the mediators, or one mediator at least, between our social position or our social surroundings and health or health inequalities. So that's, I think, the most important part of health lifestyle theory. And I have brought here with me like a little example. I think, suggest that you take a look at this maybe later, because I don't want to take up too much time. But this is a really interesting article that applies this theory to a Danish sample, and they also describe really in detail how they measured these constructs. So I think this is very beneficial to read this paper if you're interested in applying health lifestyle theory yourself. But I would like to go directly into the next theory, which is social stress theory. And I think social stress theory is actually kind of an umbrella term. So there are multiple social stress models, actually, and I will introduce some of them. But like the most important thing about the social stress theory is that these theories kind of focus on the social gradients in the distribution of stressors, because we also have basic psychological concepts, for example, the transactional stress model, but here our focus is really on the social distribution of stress, but also stress mediating resources. And so here we also have this connection between the individual and the social structure or social surroundings, but this time we focus more on the external stressors and strains. And because of that, these social stress models, they usually describe the relationship between social circumstances, as we can see here, for example, inequality, poverty, or working or living conditions, and social stressors. And then they include also stress mediators and various health and illness outcomes, for example, often mental health outcomes like depression or drug abuse, but could also be, for example, domestic violence. So, and they usually contain these elements. They describe the relationship between these concepts. And there are actually a few general models. I will introduce the stress process model by Leonard Perlin. But if you want, you can also consider the salutogenesis model by Aaron Antonovsky, a social stress theory. And then there's also work-specific models, for example, the job strain model by Robert Karasek and the effort-reward imbalance model by Johannes Sigrist. And I might talk a little bit about these even afterwards if we have time. But now I will introduce the basic stress process model, because that really set the stage, I think, for this whole area of research. It was conceptualized by another sociologist named Leonard Perlin, and it was published the first time in 1981 in this very classic paper by Perlin and colleagues. And again, as I've already mentioned, this model consists of three components. We have the sources of stress that could be life events, could be some strains that emerge from our social roles, for example, like we know work-life conflict, something like that. Could be chronic stress or even just daily hassles. Then we also have the stress mediators that could be a sense of mastery, self-esteem, but also support and coping behavior. And then there's the stress outcomes. Again, could be depression, alcohol consumption, could also be, for example, a health behavior or health lifestyle, if you want. That would also be an interesting hypothesis. And Perlin now says that, again, many stressors actually emerge from the cultural and structural circumstances of a society. For example, they emerge from financial crisis or austerity politics, discrimination, racism, etc. So therefore, the presence of stressors and also coping resources always varies between social groups. And that's, I think, the basic message of this stress process model. And as you can see here, that's a visualization of the model itself. Here we have up here the stressors, down here the resources, and this is like our dependent variable. Could be also something related to physical health, like cardiovascular diseases, for example. And this is all happening within a society, within a cultural context. And what's important here for research design, actually, the model does imply like some direct effects that go from stressors to our health outcomes. But at the same time, we also have this mediation, this mediated path. That means that stressors also damage, for example, mental health by decreasing some resources. For example, income loss may lead to a lack of self-esteem, which then impacts mental health. But at the same time, these resources can, of course, function as moderators. And that's really important because sometimes both mechanisms are actually at play. So you might, if you're employing this, if you're using this model, you might actually test both mechanisms. So you want, for example, the impact of income loss on mental health will be less severe for a person with a higher level of self-esteem or mastery. That's what this whole logic is about. And what's important to also say, and I think we've already mentioned it, but these stressors, they usually arise from different social levels. They can vary, of course, in intensity. For example, just compare a trauma to like your basic daily hassles. And they can be, there's also this continuum that you can use to like typologize stressors, whether they're discrete or very continuous, like chronic stress. And what's important, also important for research design, is that there's this kind of longitudinal logic within the stress process paradigm, because we also distinguish between primary and secondary stressors. So this means that there are some stressors that occur first, as we've already mentioned, like job loss, income loss, but they kind of they kind of spread. For example, the job loss, this is then followed by a secondary stressor, for example, family conflicts. And this process is called stress proliferation. And this is also something very important because there are actually some studies that provide evidence for this process. For example, some studies find that economic stress in early life may actually affect health in old age through these proliferation processes. And we can actually kind of think of these processes like that. For example, here we have recession at the macro level that might lead to downsizing, that might lead to work-family conflict, and then this might lead to divorce, for example. And that will, each step will have some unique mental health effects or outcomes. So this is just another example, empirical, for the distribution. I would like to just quickly also cover the mediators and moderators. For example, usually we talk about three concepts here. First one is the type of the positive self concepts, like beliefs about control, self-efficacy, sense of mastery, for example. And then there's also coping, social support, like all these factors that I think we know. But what's important, and I want to stress that, is that Perlin also includes the possibility of social mediators. For example, social policy could be like a stress mediator, or collective action, or health policy. So there's also this macro level in this model that we should and might want to address. And here again, we have the same logic that these mediators and moderators, these resources, are distributed unequally in populations. For example, studies show that There are lower, like in lower social classes, there are lower beliefs of self-efficacy and also more emotion-oriented coping compared to problem-focused coping, which of course has then negative effects on mental health. I think because of the time, I will skip the job-related models. You can, of course, all the literature is in the presentation, so you can always take a look at these articles, because I want to take also a few minutes to talk about social capital, because although that's not really like a big theory, I think it's a very important concept that actually comes from within sociology. We've talked about Pierre Bourdieu and the habitus, and social capital is also a concept by Pierre Bourdieu. He talks about social capital, economic capital, and cultural capital. However, I will now talk about social capital. And that concept is very frequently used actually in social epidemiology. And it has like these two characteristics. First, it functions as a resource, like we can use it for something. And it is basically generated through our social relationships. So, and by looking at these different types, we might actually see how that works. We can distinguish on the one hand between structural social capital, meaning the networks, like the structure of relationships that we are, as individuals, we are embedded in. And then there's the cognitive social capital, like that's trust, the support we receive or perceive that we get from other individuals of our networks. But there's also this other typology that is, I think, what's coined by Robert Putnam. He distinguishes between bonding and bridging social capital. Like bonding means the social resources that we get from our more intimate networks, like our family. And then bridging is also important because it actually connects us with our out groups. So that's kind of where all the innovation comes in. And we can probably see how that might impact our health, especially when it comes to health behavior. And that's where this illustration by Berkman and colleagues, I think is very good, because it really describes in detail how this works. Like here we see our social networks, like our social capital, and this is obviously shaped by social, structural, and also cultural conditions, like, for example, racism, discrimination, but then our network provides opportunity for some psychosocial mechanisms which then influence health, for example, through social support, influence like peer pressure, for example, but also social engagement and contact with our peers. And again, this is, I think, a very good article when it comes to these influences. What I also want to stress is, because that's missing here, obviously, when we are building networks, we are also better at influencing health policy or policy in general. So I think that's also something important to stress here. That's also a function of social capital, of course, to bring people together to move something related to politics. But what's also important is of course, there are also social costs of relationships. And so I use the term relationships because if there are like these huge social costs, I'm not sure if I would call it social capital then, but relationships are not all good. For example, you could have some demanding social obligations, or even intimate relationship violence, something like that, or relationship strain. And that is also one way by which relationships might actually damage our health. So we have to be we have to acknowledge that this is something that may be potentially more complex than often suggested. And what's important to stress is, of course, that, for example, women are usually more disadvantaged. They have to bear higher social costs due to their relationships, which is basically because of their traditional gender norms that are in place, because women, as we all know, more often have to take the role of the carer, for example. And there is a huge amount of literature that is about how to measure social capital. And I think that's very important. However, that is a very big topic. And because of this, I would just like to recommend this article. This is a really great article because it basically summarizes the whole literature on how to operationalize social capital. If you're dealing with this topic, just basically have a look at it. It's I can only recommend it if you're using social capital in your research. Next, I want to introduce, so that we're basically in time, I want to introduce fundamental cost theory. And I think that one is also especially important because, okay, now I'm, okay, sorry. Why fundamental cost theory that follows this kind of theory, it follows a bit of a different logic because it does not address the kind of the causation logic, but it tells us something about why health inequalities are actually so persistent, why they do not disappear in modern societies despite of like increases in health spending or social spending, etc. And that's what fundamental cost theory actually is trying to explain. So what is a fundamental cause? Usually, for one example of a fundamental cause would be the socioeconomic status. And such a fundamental cause is usually characterized by these 3 points here, because it can influence multiple diseases and health outcomes by modifying various risk factors. So that's really important because it's really not about one disease or one type of disease, but multiple disease and health outcomes. A fundamental cause also works through the availability of so-called flexible resources that you can use to avoid risk or to buffer negative health consequences. We will talk about that in a second. And it's also important to note that the relationship between these fundamental causes and health is usually being reproduced over time because the mechanisms that are in place, they kind of change. So first, I would like to introduce the idea of flexible resources. So as I've already mentioned, these are resources that can be used to prevent some health risks or even to improve health outcomes. And they do so regardless of which risk factors or protective factors are present or effective in a context. That's very important. So, for example, these resources include knowledge, power, money, or even we've talked about social networks. And they are called flexible because you can use them actually in very different ways. Let's just think about money. For example, you can buy higher quality healthcare with money, but you could also, for example, if you have a lot of money, like opt out of work for some time just to relax. Like there's multiple functions, so various ways that you can improve your health actually with money. Same goes for knowledge. And so as a result, these fundamental causes, because they are connected to resources, they can influence health even when one mechanism, for example, disappears. And I will talk about that now, what this means. because the relationship between fundamental causes and health inequalities is established through some specific mechanisms. And there's this whole concept of unnatural histories of diseases. I will probably skip that a little bit, and you can, that's a really interesting paper that you can read. What does that mean? Basically, these mechanisms that change, they refer to like some, as we've already talked about, for example, maybe first the mechanism was that you had infectious diseases, and the burden was higher for lower social classes, but then you get vaccinations, right? And then this mechanism disappears. So we have no inequalities. I mean, that's the ideal type, right? But that's how this theory works. We have no inequalities regarding this specific type of infectious disease. However, that then what comes in place, what takes its place is, for example, the influence of lifestyles. And that's also where these flexible, we can use these flexible resources to protect ourselves from these infectious diseases, for example, maybe because we have better access to vaccinations, but we can also use these then to create better individual lifestyles for ourselves. That's the whole idea behind this kind of fundamental cause theory. So this is also a really interesting example, and I would like to talk about this just shortly because I really like this paper. This is by Schmitz and colleagues, pretty new paper from 2024, and they analyzed the mortality rates of more than 2,000 German Catholic monks that were born between like 1840 and like 1959. And they grouped these Catholic monks according to their order titles, which they say is like their socioeconomic status. For example, the brothers being the low economic status and the padres being the high economic status. And what's really interesting, what's important to know actually about this is that these Catholic monks, even though there are different like status positions, their living conditions are largely standardized. So this status position does not lead to more flexible resources for the higher status individuals. And so this is kind of an evidence for this fundamental cause theory, actually, because what we see here are the survival curves for the monks, and the black line represents the high status individual. The gray line are the low status individual. And as we can see here by the p-values, there are no status differences between these monks. So this means that if we eliminate this logic of flexible resources, then there is actually no status difference in mortality among these monks. And the authors say that this is actually one way to actually test this fundamental cause theory, which I find actually very creative. And it also shows that this is not about, for example, genetic dispositions. This is really about the flexible resources that make the difference in that case. So before I will talk about the methodological implications shortly, I would like to introduce ecosocial theory shortly, but I assume that this is something that most people kind of know because it is a theory from within social epidemiology. But I think it's too important to not to mention it. This theory was formulated by Nancy Krieger, and I I showed you the different approaches also from her book in the beginning. And what she does with ecosocial theory is that she synthesizes the ecological, socio-political, the psychosocial, and also the biological factors that explain health and illness and health inequalities. So it's like kind of a grand theory of social epidemiology, if you want. And there are various components of her model, and the first is the logic of embodiment. So that means that the social and material circumstances, they get under your skin. So they reflect the conditions that individuals live in. So that's like her core element, and then there's different pathways to embodiment. For example, through social and economic deprivation, contact with pollutants in the environment, discrimination, traumatization, also access to healthcare, but also consumption patterns. So as you can see, there are like all our theories we were talking about, they're kind of in this ecosocial theory. And I think I will just show you the illustration, because what I would like to underscore is, for example, she obviously wants to explain population health, like the distribution, and she views this as contextualized or shaped, of course, by class injustice, racial injustice, and sexual and gender injustice. But she also takes into account the various levels of society. And that's something important, especially for the next chapter, but also the life course. So we have a multi-level and a longitudinal perspective in ecosocial theory. This is something I would like to discuss now, because to some extent, all our theories, all the theories we have just discussed, have some of these elements. And this has, of course, some very specific analytical implications when we want to apply these theories. And this is a quote that I like to use to illustrate this. Too often, data constraints and methodologies mean social scientists, and also health scientists, of course, are holding structure constant. And so this means that a lot of these macro social determinants we actually do not look at. And what do we need to actually look at these, to actually kind of make our models eco-social or socio-political? We need cross-national designs, and we need multi-level analyses. And this is actually not easy, because we need hierarchical data structures. For example, we need multiple countries so that we can address the influence of neighborhoods or welfare states or even healthcare systems. And if we, for example, if we have enough countries, if we have a cross-national survey, then we could, for example, use this simple cross-sectional multi-level analysis to test a macro-micro association. For example, is social spending associated with better self-rated health, and through which pathways is it associated with this outcome? What's important, of course, is that we cannot just do this with 2 countries. We need more level 2 units, and in the literature, it's usually the threshold is around like 30, at least 30 countries. So that's already a limitation. Often you find multi-level analysis with less countries, depends on your estimation procedure. But at least if you want to do full maximum likelihood estimation, usually the threshold is about 30 to 100 countries. And then, of course, there's the whole causality problem, and that's something that we need longitudinal or panel data for. For example, to conduct some fixed effects analyses or linear mixed effects models. Now, of course, if we keep in mind all our theories, what would be the ideal design for our research? that would be what Fairbrother calls a comparative longitudinal survey data, meaning that we have multiple levels, but also multiple points in time. And there's really not a lot of surveys that kind of offer this structure. For example, SHARE does, like the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe. So you could do something with SHARE like that. Here you have these 3 levels, and what we could do with this kind of data is we could look at individual changes and explain those through changes at the macro level. So the essence is that we could actually test the effects of social change on the individual. So, but again, this is not something that you usually find. So this is a rare occasion that you have this kind of design. And something that's also important to mention, when you have comparative surveys, you want to, as the name suggests, you want to compare countries. But that implies that the measurement instruments that you're using are functionally equivalent. So that means that they are measuring the same thing in every country. And very often this is ignored. So because you could potentially test this if you used a structural equation model, or even more specific, a multi-group confirmatory factor analysis. But very often this is neglected. So very often we actually do not know if we, for example, can compare a quality of life scale across different cultures. And there's actually a great introduction paper that, if you're interested in this whole topic, you could read by Potnick and Bornstein from 2017. And of course, if there's literature that suggests that where these scales are tested, you don't have to test them yourself. For example, if you're using the Euro-D scale, that's a depression inventory for, I think, older people. That has been tested for 18 countries. So if you want to do an analysis in 18 countries with this, so you wouldn't have to test this. Obviously, you would just quote this this article. But I think that's really important. And the other thing I would like to address before I stop talking is the topic of intersectionality. This could, of course, be included in the theory part, but I think it's also a methodological issue, because we know that inequality dimensions matter, right? And we also, it also makes sense, and that's what intersectionality is about, that these inequality dimensions, they interact. For example, you can be discriminated because of your gender, but also because of your ethnic background, but also because, for example, you are a woman with a migration background. So these categories can obviously interact, and this is something that we might want to test, but we need actually large sample sizes. So in order to do so, and for example, this is a nice example from a really current study by Lewandowski, and they actually analyzed more than 36,000 US citizens. And as you can see here, they categorized the individuals in accordance to their inequality dimension affiliation. And this is the predicted probability for reporting excellent or good health here. And as you can see, the people who are white and above poverty, no disability, heterosexual, they have the highest probability for reporting excellent or very good health. On the other hand, the Black, Indigenous, people of color, below poverty with disability here, they have the lowest probability. So this is really something that I think we should do more in social epidemiology. And there are actually 2 really great papers that show how to do that, especially this one. because there's this method you can use. I'm not an expert on this, but I recommend reading this literature. Also requires some knowledge about multi-level analysis, so there's really many reasons to get familiar with this. But anyway, just to throw that in, of course, all this seems very, very complex, and there's this nice quote of Perlin. So obviously we cannot like test this in one paper. We cannot propose this huge eco-social model within just one paper. So obviously Perlin says we should take smaller steps, and I agree with that. But I think we should also keep these theories in mind and maybe take a deeper look at some of the mechanisms at play, and also think bigger in terms of using cross-national samples, or also creating more of these comparative longitudinal surveys. So I think I'll close with that, and I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you could you found this input like a little bit helpful and interesting. Obviously, feel free to contact me if you want the presentation slides. There's also some literature recommendations, and if you look at the here at the literature, every source is in here, so you can read everything that you're interested in. So thank you very much, and I think we might have time for a little discussion even. So
yeah,
thank you. And I will. Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, you can stop sharing if you.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And yeah, this was a wonderful session. I really learned a lot, and I hope everybody as well. And in a nutshell, you can see that theory really matters in research, particularly in the field of social epidemiology. And no matter the kind of theory that we are talking about, fundamental cause, ecology, eco-social theory, or social capital, these are all very important to help us frame our work, to understand why inequalities exist, and that these inequalities don't just exist, but it helps us to be able to design maybe good research, like how Chris has been able to explain to us, to be able to understand these inequalities. And I must admit, this is not an easy topic to understand, because it really involves a lot, and Chris has been able to really break this down with this very short time for us. I think give us a very good overview of everything, and yeah, I think that's very great, and I've really learned a lot, Chris. I hope you all have learned as well. So we still have some minutes. If you have questions, please just feel free to ask, and he's able to answer them. You can also feel free, if you don't want to ask here, you can follow him on the ResearchGate on LinkedIn and many other platforms. He's there also. You can always connect with him, and yeah, again, he's an expert in this field and he knows a lot. So feel free to reach out to him and with your questions. So if you have any questions, please just raise your hand sign, and then we'll get to you so that you can ask your question, please. Yeah, John T, please go ahead.
Can you hear me right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
If we're saying, like, if we're moving all back to social structural determinants of health, where do you think we should draw the line as to like how much personal responsibility should people have on their health, or should it all be targeted at sort of big government organizations, corporations?
That is a very important question, and I think it's also not very easy, because as many of these theories show us, like there is always this influence that we get from our social background. So and I think what these theories, I don't actually know if they can provide a satisfactory answer to that question. But I do think what they show us is that we need to pay more attention also to these structural surroundings when we are doing research. Now, that I think that doesn't mean that we should communicate this in a way that, oh, it's only structure that matters, because I think that wouldn't be that helpful. You have to, I think, identify like these areas of agency that we talked about, where how can we create agency? For example, through improving health literacy, something like that. Like, I think because we know that we are, let me put it that way, because we know that we are at least partly influenced by our surroundings. I think it's even more important to take a look at where we can create and how we can create agency when it comes to health in the populations. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. Any question? So I know you already explained it, but in simple terms, like how can an early career researcher like practically integrate this aspect of theory into his research design? Like somebody, an early career researcher, an epidemiologist, social epidemiologist, early, how can he like integrate these ideas of theory, like when they want to design a good research? Because I think this is important because you have to consider this when you are planning the analysis, all of this. So like, what is the best steps to take into consideration, or the best steps, yeah, you can take?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And I think the most important step, I think, is getting familiar with the theories, with the models. Like, what does the model itself imply?
Yeah.
For example, if I want to do something with the stress process model, obviously, then it would be beneficial, for example, to have longitudinal data. So I can investigate these stress proliferation processes, like how is stress spreading across the life course, for example. And then I would, for example, look at what is already available. Like, is this something, for example, I could do with the share study? Like, then I could also use this theory, and that's like where I come from, to guide me in the process of designing my own survey, for example. I could use an instrument to measure chronic stress or life events. I could use, for example, a scale on, there's actually a good scale, for example, on sense of mastery. I would combine these in a survey, and maybe then do like an online access panel study if I'm really just interested in the longitudinal dimension, for example. But I think the very first step is always knowing what the theory is about, knowing what the model is about, and then looking what is available in terms of data, in terms of scales or measurement instruments, and of course, what is available in terms of like my resources. If I'm an early career researcher, I will probably not be able to conduct like a huge cross-national survey with multiple waves. That's just like I would have to write a grant with probably 100 other researchers to get this running. So start by reading the literatures, getting familiar with the models, and think, what does the model imply in terms of research design? Is this something longitudinal? Can I do this in a cross-sectional design? is this available somewhere, or do I have to maybe conduct like an own little study? So that's how I would do that.
Cool, thanks. And so this is just a general question about maybe your experience. So have you faced, maybe in your work and publications, have you faced like any challenges, maybe with reviewers trying to convince them about maybe particular theories that you used in your work? Like, I mean, generally convincing reviewers or collaborators about the value of theory in your research. Have you had any such encounters?
I have actually made the kind of the opposite experience. I have, but that might be something a bit specific to sociology. Like when you're publishing in a health sociology journal, very often, if your study is too descriptive and if you don't address theories enough, then you will get a reject because they say, oh, there's no theory. So where does this come from? Where do your assumptions come from? And I think the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is actually that I have the impression that a lot of these surveys, and I know that because I'm also in this whole survey designing team, for example, for the social survey, very often they do not include some very important concepts. They might have an instrument on stress, even on social support, but for example, then the whole control or coping thing is missing. So you can't test the whole model. And I think that's, I would like to think that's something that should be stressed, that when we are creating these surveys, these research projects, we should have these theories actually in mind before we do that. So I think that was my biggest challenge, but I'm also a survey researcher, so that might be a little bit specific.
Yeah, I think that's very good, because like this, I didn't really, sometimes, like you said, I just integrate some of the aspects of theories in the survey, but usually not all. Maybe at the end when you design your survey, then before you realize that, probably this is not, and then you have to find a way but to make the analysis work and create some sense out of what the data you collected. But I think if we think of all of this before we even go ahead to design the surveys, it really makes sense. Alphonse is having a question. Please just go ahead. Is Alphonse there? Fonzie, I see your hand raised up. Okay, maybe it's a mistake and he doesn't hear us. So if we don't have any questions.
Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Can you hear me?
Now it works.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for giving me the opportunity. So I think I just wish to ask a question, like it's almost in line with what you asked, but a bit different. Like for a young researcher who is just coming, who is new into the game, like how will you advise him, like how to go about in choosing maybe theories that will fit best in his or her research? Like what's the easiest tips he can use to choose a theory or a method to run his research?
That's an interesting question, and I think that's something that I'm asking myself sometimes. What I like to do actually is I like to think in terms of what's the dependent variable of your project. Like for example, if it's depression or mental health. Like I know this because I'm usually doing research on mental well-being and related indicators. So I usually start with the dependent variable and look at like what are the main predictors. Like just like find a meta-analysis, find a review, like what are the social determinants of depression or any other condition. And then if you found out what they are, and you see, for example, oh, this is more of a stress issue, or this is more of a behavioral thing, then you can, I think, then it's much easier to find the perfect theory for your research project. Because, of course, you could just, when you're, for example, when you're doing a survey or you're designing your own research project, it's not helpful just to throw all concepts in your questionnaire, because that will take like 2 hours. So maybe just find some literature on your dependent variable, on the most important like social determinants of that, and then from there try to find out which of these theories might actually be the best for you. I think that's how I do it. Maybe there's better ways, but this is just my recommendation. I hope this is helpful to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so again, thank you very much, Mr. Chris, for this excellent session. We are left with 4 minutes before we round up. So I will also want to thank those who were able to join us today. And yeah, please feel free to connect with us on our social media handles, LinkedIn in particular, Facebook, and also stay tuned. We have more of these important and interesting sessions on social epidemiology coming up in the next months. So yeah, feel free to join them as well, and yeah, learn a lot from there. So with that said, I will want to wrap up this session and say thank you for joining. Thank you again, Mr. Chris, for speaking to us, and yeah, hope we see you on the other side, and yeah, keep connecting and hopefully collaborating on many other important topics. So thanks very much again, and yeah, wish everybody a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. It was an honor, real pleasure. Have a nice weekend. And if anybody wants the slides, just hit me up, or maybe Jude, maybe you can send it out. I can send you my slides and you just throw it in the group. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I will get the slides and then I will share it, send it out to them, and also the link to this video to those who could not join. Yeah, I will share it on LinkedIn so that people watch it on YouTube as well. I will upload this video on our YouTube channel, that people can watch it from there. So yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, thanks a lot again, and yeah, see you. Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.